everybody. It's October 2020. We're here in Marco Island, Florida. My name is Matthew Cohen, and I'm with Ted Schilowitz, a good buddy of mine for many, many years. And we want to thank you for including us in the FUTR conference. I got a couple questions for Ted, for you guys to hear. So how does a New York boy growing up in the backwoods of Florida wind up becoming a futurist?
It's a good question. First, let me give you some context as to what's happening here and why we're doing this. So this was on my agenda to record this session to send off to this conference in Asia that they asked me to be a part of. And a couple days ago, you said, hey, let's go out on the boat. So here we are on the boat, and I kind of forgot that we still needed to do that recording. So I said, we'll just do it from the boat. It'll be fine. So it's a beautiful morning in southern Florida, and we're getting ready to strike out and do some sailing today on Matt's boat. And it's lovely to be with you all this morning. To answer that first question, I get that question a lot, right? Because it's sort of this interesting role that I found myself into after now I guess 35-ish plus year in the media world, ending up being this odd title called a futurist for a large media corporation, right? And I've now done this for two very large media corporations over the last 10 years of my life. And as I thought about it once, actually when I was giving a speech on stage, someone asked that question, and I had to kind of think about it in real time, and I sort of realized that my upbringing, when my parents moved me to this very odd place when I was very young, from New York, with a small stop in Georgia, to this place called Orlando, Florida, that in the early 70s was still a pretty backwards place. It was kind of scary, kind of racist, not what you would think of a modern society. That was in the early 70s, like 1970. And that was the first year of my life in Florida. The second year of my life in Florida, this other odd thing happened, and they opened Walt Disney World. And I sort of got thrust into the future. I essentially learned that there was a whole nother way of thinking about how to approach problems, how to solve problems, how to take risks, how to try new things. And it was ingrained in me in a very early age. Like, I saw things, and I ended up doing all this work over the years with Disney and Universal and all this stuff in Florida. But at a very early age, when I was a little kid, I saw the idea of openness. I saw the idea of like inclusiveness and respecting other cultures and ideas. And I saw, most importantly, the idea of change is good. Like, if something wasn't working in one of the theme parks, they would change it. They would try something new, and they continually tried something new. And they even developed a term, even before they, Walt and his team in Florida brought his idea to Florida. They had this thing called Imagineering, which still holds and exists today and is a very important tenet of how they propel things into the future. So it just kind of dropped into me at a very early age, and that's essentially why I think I'm very comfortable with change and trying new things and bringing ideas and concepts to the executives at these movie studios that I work at, first with 20th Century Fox, and now currently at Paramount Pictures, which is part of Viacom CBS, this very large media organization.
So I think we're all kind of aspiring futurists. So from a career perspective, how do you attempt to make the leap into one of these kinds of roles?
Yeah, and I think I'm an aspiring futurist as well. Like, I joke with my friends and with the people I work with that I'm not really a futurist. No, there's no such thing as really a futurist. I call myself a futurist in training, right? Which is essentially what my job description is that what I effectively do for a living these days is I'm a professional explorer. I'm constantly looking at new technologies, new ways to solve problems within the media sphere, and figure out how to compel a new audience in new ways with new tools and where that intersection lives. So I like to make a sort of a story tale reference that I'm a professional frog kisser, meaning in that famous story, you gotta kiss a lot of frogs to find your prince or your princess, right? And in my case, I'm constantly meeting with startups, looking at new technology, looking at emerging technology, looking at things that won't hit the market for 10, maybe 15 years, right? And starting to see, is that gonna be something? And most of the time, they're not gonna be anything. But every once in a while, there's something where you start to see the trajectory of something and you say, it's not anything valuable yet, but the tenets of it are really valuable. The essence of it is really valuable. And as it develops and evolves into real productization, it could become the next big thing. And my job effectively is to look for the next big thing.
So it's funny you mentioned, so the, you know, the evolution of the screen, of the big screen, and obviously the metaphor of the little screen. Tell us about your ideas around everything really being TV.
Yeah, it's a big part of my speeches that I typically give around the world in real life, traveling around on airplanes. The last 8 months now, it's been all via this kind of technology, via some remote video conference technology. But the metaphor that I like to use, which people really resonate with, is the idea that if you think about what we've done as sort of a global society and how we effectively do almost everything, we've TVized everything. We've turned almost every behavior that we do into some version of television, right? So, like, look at the thing that people would arguably say they maybe do the most during the course of a day is send emails out, right? Well, that used to be a physical thing. We used to write mail on a piece of paper and put it in a physical thing and seal it up and put it in another physical thing called a mailbox, and someone would take it out of a physical thing and open it up. We essentially turned that behavior into TV, right? We don't do it on a physical properties anymore. We do it on a little sort of mobile television, right? Which is this thing, right? It's not a phone. This is a mobile compute device that can essentially be anything, but at the end of the day, what it really is a little TV screen that has a lot of power behind it. So we can essentially virtualize things like mail. We can also virtualize things like shopping, right? So one of the largest corporations in the world essentially figured out that link between television and shopping. And it started out with something that was a bit of a joke, right? So like this thing that in the United States, I'm sure in Asia too, we would call the home shopping network, where, like, you know, old women would be buying ceramic cats on TV, and you would think that's ridiculous. Like, it's not going to be a big business. Well, it turns out that the evolution of buying ceramic cats on TV is this thing we call Amazon, where people buy everything they need effectively on TV, right? In Asia, it's Alibaba, right? And they're humongous corporations because they figured out how to harness the power of TV. Now think about everything else we do with TV, right? We gossip on TV. That's Facebook and Instagram, and, you know, all the social networks and WhatsApp and WeChat, right? That's effectively gossip on TV and messaging on TV, right? We share information on TV. And the other thing that's really interesting is a generation ago when we were kids, it was really hard to be on TV, right? You had to have this like huge technological infrastructure, huge cost dynamics, and very few people were actually on TV. Today, with devices like this, that we're recording this on an iPad, mounting it on a boat, and here we are recording it, we're going to send it off to Singapore in a few moments. The world is now on TV, right? Everyone's doing Zoom and Skype and FaceTime, and constantly billions and billions of people have effectively harnessed the power of TV because of the evolution of technology. And it's such a powerful force that, like, it's impossible to almost grapple it all. Like, that the fact that a generation ago there were only a few people on TV. Now, essentially everyone you know and everyone they know has been on some version of TV. And not just like once a month or once a year, every single day they're on TV because they're doing video chat. That's communication, right?
Right.
The interesting thing about that, though, and the power that's been unlocked with that, is part of the dynamic of what I have to do is study everything as a startup opportunity, right? So if you look at the companies that should have capitalized on this thing of everything turned into a version of TV, it should have been the big TV companies, right? The ABC, NBC, CBSs of the world. And while they partially capitalized on it, it was new young startups and new technology companies that really had no business being in TV that figured out how to evolve TV,
right,
and make TV this two-way communication device. And the stalwarts, these multi-billion-dollar companies, lag behind that. Now they're just starting to catch up. So the metaphors of, you know, streaming and OTT and all these things, they don't often come from big established companies that have a built-in value quotient. They understand how to do a business this way. They come from a couple of young kids in a garage somewhere that's like, I wonder if we could use the power of this, if we could harness the power of this, that the shoulders of giants that we stand on, in a new way. And that becomes Netflix, and that becomes Twitch, and that becomes all these new dynamics of media that the big companies catch up on. It's my job to try and communicate to the executives that I work with at the movie studio and at the larger media organization that we need to be thinking more like a startup. We need to be looking to how do we cannibalize and evolve our existing businesses to find new businesses, because if we don't do it, someone's going to do it for us. And that's what's happened over and over again. So that's kind of what we learn as we study. Like my study and practice is basically to be a forcing agent to make sure that the people at the top of the food chain that are running these businesses day to day know that these businesses will not just stay in a static form, that they're dynamic, that the media is going to change, the audience is going to change. That's what we learn.
That's great. That leads me into another good question in terms of the leadership inside of some of these mega corporations, and the executives are big personalities.
Yes.
And how do you go about kind of influencing a team that is already kind of leading and driving? How do you become more effective at that?
It's a super good question, right? And I think it starts with the openness of those personalities at the top. So like in my case, I work with the chairman of the studio, a guy named Jim Giannopoulos, and the CEO of the Viacom CBS Corporation, a guy named Bob Bakish. They're both very similar in certain ways. They're both very open to new things, while their day-to-day life is in the here and now, is making sure that they're growing the business, they're running the business, they're optimizing the business, and they're working with all of these people. They're huge organizations with thousands and thousands of employees, right? They also have an eye out for the future. They have a knowledge, an intimate knowledge that their business will change with them or without them. So it gives me a certain odd job security, because they like to have someone with a arguably slightly powerful and a little bit odd voice in the room that's willing to speak his mind and say, look, I've been tracking this, I'm studying this, I think these are things we need to pay attention to. They're not necessarily businesses yet, but they might be and probably will be, and we need to get ahead of it. And that's essentially my message to them. So I'm constantly in those meetings and these task force groups and things to think about stuff, but it really comes from a certain sort of mentality from those executives that a part of their brain and a part of their resources has to be dedicated not to what they're doing today, but what might happen tomorrow, or a few pieces down the, a few moves on the chessboard down the road. So again, to give you another storybook reference, I like to sort of say that in the role of that executive boardroom that sometimes I have to sit in, I'm the court jester inside that world, right? So they like having me close, they like smiling, they like kind of knowing that there's someone looking out for something different than they are. But at the end of the day, I just try and be this sort of jovial force of positive toward the future. That these are not threats. If you take advantage of things early enough, they're explorations and you can learn from them.
Sure.
Doesn't mean you're always going to get it right, but there's all these sort of phrases of you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? So if you're going to take some shots, you learn how to get better at it. And the idea is get up to bat, take some swings, see what happens, see what you're going to learn. How do you evolve and develop your organization to know how to interact and link to their customer base in better and new and different ways than they did yesterday. And that's really my role at the studio.
So earlier in the year, the pandemic had us pretty much shut down, and we're in another phase, so to speak. Obviously it's had a tremendous impact on the entertainment industry.
Absolutely, yeah.
What do you think is the rebound? I mean, is there a time frame? Is there strategy?
It's a super good question. I actually don't think it's a rebound. I think it's an evolution. I think it's an agent of change, right? So you obviously can't make light of how the seriousness of this is, and the death toll and the dynamic change in the economic of everything, right, that this pandemic has caused. But it's also my job to look at the silver linings, to look at how do you approach problems as opportunities, even a problem like this that is so massive and so just changeable in so many ways about, the drama of people's lives has been really affected, right? And the economics of people's lives have been affected. What I start to study is, what are we not going back from now? Like, we look at the change in the way that telecommunications has changed over the last 8 months. The amount of people that used to make physical, normal phone calls, voice to voice, and sit in meeting rooms together on a daily basis has completely changed into a virtualization of everyone uses some sort of video chat client, right? And a really good example of that is if you study this little startup, Zoom, that you'd think, well, there's plenty of video chat clients out in the world that are already well established. All the big tech companies have their own. But here's this little startup, right, that comes in and says, we're going to try and like rejigger this a little bit and offer a slightly different business model and a slightly different user interface, and it just catches on. And when the pandemic started, Zoom started its sort of meteoric market value rise, right? A month or two into the pandemic, which was the spring, Zoom had a bigger valuation than all 7 of the largest worldwide airline companies combined. It had like a $50 billion valuation, right? And that was in March of 2020, right?
Right.
And the United, Southwest, Delta, and all the other big airlines combined, the top 7 had less than a $50 billion valuation. Now flash forward to today, October, right? You have 2020. Zoom's valuation is bigger than IBM. It's bigger than Boeing. It's bigger than 3M. These like huge corporations that have existed for many, many generations and generate real value to their stockholders over and over again. And here's this little startup that is now at a higher valuation. And it's a little hard to sort of grok that, to kind of put that into real terms, right? But it's just the fervor of the market and the fervor of understanding that once someone locks into this agent of change, it can be something extraordinarily valuable. And who knows how long that value will last, right? Because there's nothing really all that unique about the Zoom video chat client versus Skype or FaceTime or WebEx or BlueJeans or any of the others, or Google, Hangout or any of those we use on a daily basis. Just they found this interesting chemistry. And that's essentially part of what I study is, why does this chemistry work a little better than those chemistries? And is that a long-term effect or a short-term effect? Will that just fade away, which we see a lot of technologies that have a moment, and that moment may be a couple of months, a couple of years, and then poof, right? And others that just seem to hold on and evolve, right? If you look at a company like Facebook, for all the critique we could put on Facebook in all kinds of various ways, their executive team and their leadership looks at things like Instagram, and maybe we should get Instagram, and they do, or WhatsApp, right? And they see that these are disruptive forces that are going to come in to their universe and start disrupting them, so they go on the attack. And their version of attack is acquire them, figure them out, right? So
Definitely.
that's where you get that from. So turn my hat around so you can see my face a little bit.
You've been playing at the light. The sun's coming up.
Yep.
You've been playing with VR, 3D, augmented, all kinds of versions of immersive experiences.
New stuff, right?
And for quite some time.
Yep.
And do you think this is an opportunity for those technologies? And
yeah, I think what's interesting is when you study it from a broader lens, what is really going on with this thing we call virtual reality, mixed reality, extended reality, is what we're doing is we're evolving the screen. We're evolving TV, right? We're evolving the thing you're all watching this on now. Because likely you're watching this on a bunch of little rectangles with a bunch of other people. And our entire sort of existence, from anybody from our generation, our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, our great-grandparents' generation, has been locked into this understanding that media in various forms, including books, is in some sort of rectangular or square shape, where it starts and ends, where we know this is the media, right? This is the device, this is the media, this is the sphere that it lives in, and we know where it starts and we know that there's a border on it. And the popular form today of that is a rectangle, right? So everything is sort of a rectangle. And what's happening with this next generation of screen is I refer to it as breaking out of the rectangle. We are essentially entering an age with the evolution and the sophistication of the compute stack and the screen technology that allows us to start to, at the very first time at like a global scale, break out of this rectangular form of how we consume our media, our social, our productivity, our everything, right? We talked about the TV of everything, right? The TV of everything is starting to change because now we can buy very inexpensive devices that allow a screen to track with us, so that we put this thing on our face. Arguably, it's still the wrong form factor. It's this goofy little box that we put on our face, right, today. But what the power of that is not the form factor, which is still incorrect, but is evolving. it's what's inside that form factor, is a kind of a screen technology that as you move your head, your eyes, the pixels shift with it in real time. And as you move your physical body, in the case of what we call a 6 degree of freedom screen, the pixels actually move in space, in three-dimensional space, as if they were really your eyes, right? So like if I get physically closer to you, every single pixel changes in my point of view, right? And my physical body has moved. If I moved around the boat, everything would change. Up until now, that was a very exotic thing to do, up until the last, let's call it 4 or 5 years, right? Starting really in 2014, 2015 was this new renaissance of this thing we called virtual reality, because we realized we could take the compute stack that lived in smartphones and the kind of displays that lived in smartphones and make modifications to that, and the chipsets that powered computers and make modifications to that, to turn virtual reality into a consumer durable, and something that like would go mass scale, right? And now it's starting to happen. It's still years away from being really mass scale, but I mentioned Facebook before, they're one of the leaders in this. They bought this startup called Oculus, right? It wasn't Facebook themselves that made the revolution. It was this tiny little startup out of Irvine, California, a couple of kids in a room, right? That even earlier started at USC with a kid in a room, right? That started to figure out stuff that wasn't new. Like, he didn't invent anything. That team didn't invent anything new. They just evolved what was already there. And they innovated, right? And they put it into a package, and they started to figure out there might be some commercial viability to this. Now, flash forward 5 years, you have a multi-$100 million business for many companies, and then a potentially billion-dollar business for Facebook and the 5 or 6 other companies that are dancing around figuring out hardware, right? The next evolution of this hardware, all the big monster trillion-dollar tech giant companies are 100% getting involved in. We call that augmented or mixed reality, which will change the form factor from this boxy thing on your face to more like the glasses you're wearing on your face right now, and eventually even more exotic concepts like contact lenses or even implants that will tap into our visual cortex, right? And it sounds like crazy science fiction, but that's what I do for a living, is study crazy science fiction. Luckily, I work for the company that developed Star Trek, right? So I kind of live in the world of Star Trek and look at, oh, those are all the things that Star Trek figured out. The holodeck is very often referred to as a concept that we understood from the media world that's actually becoming real now. So I can basically strap the holodeck onto my face, and I do that on a daily basis. Maybe not today, because I've got the real world that I'm going to go out and sailing. But on a normal basis, when I'm sitting on land, almost every day I'm putting on a virtual reality or a mixed reality headset for hours a day and doing things like video chats in virtual reality, spatial video chats, where you and I could actually be doing this in a space. Like, we could build this boat in 3D. And you could be in your office in Manhattan, and I could be in my office in California, whatever that is, which is now a house, right? We don't really go to the office anymore. And we could be on the boat together doing this chat. And it would feel, even though it's a video version of you, but it's dimensional.
Right.
Like, it would feel like I'm having this conversation with you on a boat. And we could even simulate the rocking of the boat, and we could simulate the birds, and we could simulate the sky. That's why we call it virtual reality. It's essentially simulation behavior. We can lock into a simulation with technology, and we can create that for almost any viable use case. Gaming, entertainment of all forms, socialization, and productivity. Like, anything we did in the real world, we could do in this new virtual real world that used to be super expensive. Used to be these multi-$1,000 computers and very expensive headsets. Became commercialized in the mid-20s, 2014, 2015 timeframe. Then it was in the low thousands, and now flash forward 2020, 5 years later, it's in the low hundreds. Like, we could buy a viable headset today to do everything I just talked about for $300. Completely viable. And I have one in my bag. You know, I take it with me on the boat. Not that I really plan on using it today, but I have it with me all the time, because you never know when I want to hop into a game or do this, not on a traditional screen, on something where we've broken out of that rectangular form.
Well, listen, Ted, the tide's coming up, and it's time to cast off the lines. So
I agree. So we'll wrap up.
Thank you so much. Really a pleasure to join you guys, and take care.